deeper, and it's your stage.
Thanks. Well, anyway, so before I start, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I've actually really love this little conferences. A couple of people asked me today why I come to these little conferences. It's because it's small. It's a small community, and you see how tight the community is. And it's a different experience because every culture has a different way of addressing problems and talking to each other and communicating. So it's always interesting. So my presentation this afternoon is, I thought I saw a hacksaw. It's a play on words from Tweety Pie, if you remember the cartoon from the 60s, 70s. It's about threat hunting. So threat hunting started a couple of years ago as a keyword, and we'll get into that. So before that, so my name is Thomas. I have been in this industry for a very long time. A very long time. I did incident response for a number of global companies, let's just say it that way, as an end user, customer. I'm also run BSides London, so very nice little conference as well. Not little. You're welcome to come if you want. And I'm also a board member of the IWSA. I like to exchange information. I like to share knowledge. I like to bring people into the community and make sure that everybody feels welcome in the community. So what about threat hunting? So as I said, threat hunting became a keyword a few years ago, and it's even now, I think SANS has even got a course on threat hunting now. But threat hunting is essentially above the IR process, right? So it's an initial step so that you can initiate your IR process, so your incident response process. But most of it is because we've come to a position now that most companies have a very opaque infrastructure. They don't know what's going on in their infrastructure. And that's true, you know, with new people coming in, you see new services, you see new applications, you see new devices. The other problem is the adversaries have become more and more intelligent and more cunning, and they're playing with the tools that we have in our infrastructure. I'm sure you saw that Microsoft had to release a statement or a tech note to its customers this week on the DDE attacks. The funny thing is, those DDE attacks have been going on, pen testers have been using them for 3 years. I used it in a demo 3 years ago, right? So it's been there for a while, and the attackers know this, and they're using this against us. Compromise is a given, right? So we know, and we've always said it, you're compromised, just live with it and figure out how to deal with it later. It's a natural evolution of incident response, because incident response, typically you're starting with something that you know, but how do you do an incident response on something that you don't know? And we're moving away from automation, and we're starting to look at moving away from the traditional linear type of incident response to observe, orient, decide, and act. This is very military, right? So you're looking at things, you find something, and you act upon it. So the principle of threat hunting is that it's a process of actively searching inside your environment for evidence of something that you've never detected before. So if you think APT, right, Advanced Persistent Threats, this is one way of finding an advanced persistent threat in your environment, because you're looking for something that you've never seen before. But the underlying statement is that you actually are capable of looking at those events and have those events somewhere stored somewhere so that you can get at them and analyze them. And this is where we come to the analysis part. Is interesting because we're no longer talking about an incident responder. We're talking about an analyst who's looking and fighting an adversary, right? It's essentially a dog and cat game, right? So the analyst is playing the dog and he's trying to chase the cat. So we're looking at things in a different way. We really want to kind of say, I'm an analyst. How does the adversary attack me? What is he doing? How do I think like an adversary? What am I looking for? It's also about being creative and adaptive. So you're not relying on any indicators. You're not relying on anything that you know. So you have to be kind of creative. So you have to think outside of the box. You have to think like the attackers would think. You know, if you notice, I'm repeating that we have to think like the attackers, because what you want to do is find that initial stage, that how they entered into your environment and what they did in your environment. But in practice, you're looking at going through a lot of logs, a lot of events that you've collected. There's no particular indicators. Anybody who tells you that they're threat hunting and they're basing it on an alarm, they're not threat hunting. That's incident response. You do not have alarms when you start your threat hunting process. It's a deep analysis of a potentially compromised host, right? So if you think something's wrong on an endpoint or a server, you go through that endpoint server's logs, you go through everything, that's what you do with forensics dumps and things like that, and you look for something that you've never seen before. And I said it before, we're not talking about alerts. We're talking about things that do not get picked up by your traditional or your next generation detection systems. But there's an underlying thing with this, is that you have to understand the environment that you're working in. You have to define what looks like a normal event, what looks like normal events in your environment. So essentially, the analyst needs to have a fundamental knowledge of how the business works, of what's going on in the business. They need to understand how users use the applications on a daily basis, how endpoints are communicating to servers, how servers are communicating to each other. Because what you're going to look for is something that doesn't fit in that normal pattern that you're seeing every day. So the best threat hunters are the ones that are sitting there and they're looking at events all day, but they also understand the business. They also know that, normal business operations is from 9 to 5, for example, in a factory. That when people come in the morning, they start their emails, so you see a spike of activity in email. If you see a spike of activity in email in the middle of the night, it's probably something wrong with that endpoint or that environment. So you have to understand what's going on in that, and that's where it's about building a picture of understanding and defining normal in your environment. But so what? So you're building this proactive footprint against your attackers. If you have a baseline, if you know what you're doing, how your environment behaves, if something comes out at normal, you've actually built a proactive footprint. You can detect something in your logs and you can say, oh, okay, something's going on here. Let's start looking at what's happening. Let's go deeper. You understand your infrastructure better. So you start to do a system and application gap analysis. You start to do better inventory processes. The other day, I interviewed for a job with a mobile operator in the UK that's been in the news a number of times in the past couple of years. First thing I asked the CISO was, so how's your inventory management? We don't have one. We have to build it. And I'm like, there's a couple of guys, based in the UK. If you're based in the UK, you probably know which operator I'm talking about. But if you're doing threat hunting, understanding that environment, understanding what systems you have in place, it's going to give you an organizational knowledge, right? It's going to give you an understanding of what's happening. Businesses love organizational knowledge. Why? Because you're documenting what's happening in the business. You're giving back something to the business, telling them this is how the systems operate. These are what our critical systems are. These are what our critical assets are. This is what we need to protect. It's a different way of looking at protecting the environment. And the important thing is you're building contextual knowledge, right, and awareness. So you start to understand the context of events. You start to understand that one event, when you're seeing a flow between an application and the outside world, that's normally happening only to certain partners. When you start to see it happening to an unknown IP address in China, that's something that's contextually out of bounds. So that's where you're going to start looking at your threat hunting. So, these are some of the graphics that you can find. Threat hunting, and this is threat hunting. The reality, I work for data protection. I look at data protection. Where is data used? It's used on the endpoint. So one of my remits when I was doing this was, how am I going to analyze all the data that I can gather on an endpoint? And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But you get just dumps and dumps of data. So how do you analyze it? Well, you analyze it. But the fact of the matter, marketing makes you feel like the top image when they talk about threat hunting. The reality is threat hunting is a lot more like the bottom image. It's a tedious, laborious piece of work. So what do you do? How do you do this? Well, you need logs, lots and lots of logs. So typically you might start with your firewalls, your IDS and IPSs, your network devices, some of the endpoint solutions. There are open source tools for this as well, like BroIDS, passive DNS, autoruns. You can do PowerShell logging, WMI logging. You can do WinRM. All of these things will gather logs for you. Traditionally, what I've seen is that, in fact, a lot of the, except if they're linked to an endpoint vendor, a lot of the people that talk about front hunting, they're more focused on the network activity because that's what you've traditionally collected in the environment. You store the network activity. War is 99% information, right? It's pretty much a well-known phrase. Essentially, what you're going to do is you're going to start to log things and look for suspicious things. So firewall logs, you might look for unusual IP addresses or countries that you don't do business with. Proxy logs, if you're using proxies, these are interesting things. Look for unusual proxy traffic. Why would you see port 22 on a proxy? Bytes in equals bytes out. So this is interesting because, well, think about traffic patterns. How many times do you see between an endpoint, I'm talking about from an endpoint, so like from your computer out to the internet, how many times do you see that the exact amount of data is flowing in and out of an endpoint? Exactly, not very often. Somebody's shaking their head in the front. You don't. Most traffic comes in because you're browsing the web or you're downloading from the application, and most of the outbound traffic is very small because you're sending small bits of data, or you're sending, like an OK or things like that. Look for unique user strings. Right? On the Windows logs, you can look for logon attempts, user adds to privileged groups. Antivirus logs, I mean, everybody complains about antivirus logs, but, if you see if there's triggers in your antivirus, that could be the sign of somebody trying to download some kind of backdoor or download some kind of rat, and they're just trying to see what antivirus you have in place. Process maps, we'll get in a little bit more into this, but you need to understand what systems run in your environment. What are the privilege escalations? There's also endpoint detection solutions. So, think Carbon Black, Cylance, Mandiant, I'll get a little bit more into some of these later, but all of these new endpoint solutions that are basically gathering data for you on the endpoint, right? They're giving you that data. If you know how to use it, it can become very good knowledge. You need to analyze this. So typically what we see is you're going to put it into your SIM. This is why SIM vendors talk about threat hunting. Because you can basically triple, quadruple the amount of information you're dumping into the SIM. Are there any SIM vendors here? I know Javad left, so he's Alien Vault. The guy from Alien Vault's not here. But I've seen, so we use Splunk in some of the stuff that we do. We had to quadruple our Splunk indexing license when we actually started doing this properly with some of our customers, because we're a managed service provider as well. It's very easy. So as you can understand, SIM vendors are actually really interested in this because, hey, lots of more data. We can start charging more, right? Get more data, you have to pay more. However, I've been playing with this, and it'll probably be the subject of a future presentation. ELK is really good for this, right? So if you're good with open source and you know the Elasticsearch and Kibana stack, I've seen a lot of good work done with ELK around this. The new thing nowadays is, so I didn't write it, but I tried to make analytics, a picture for analytics, grab a picture for analytics. Basically, analytics, what it is adding intelligence to that platform. So letting the platform do some of the analysis of all the data that's coming in. It's a new term for SIMs, basically. So then I started to go down the road. It's like, okay, you start to talk about attribution. You start to talk about, oh, who did this to me? Why did they do it to me? That's not really the purpose of threat hunting. Attribution is more part of the incident response process. Once you've done your forensics dumps, once you've understood exactly what's happened to your environment, you do your report, and then you might do some attribution. So I've seen people talk about, oh, we need to link this to, lately, it's this one. Does anybody know what this one is? So this is MITRE ATT&CK. So if you look at Twitter and stuff like that, there's a lot of talk about MITRE ATT&CK. Basically, it's a kill chain, but from the point of view of the post-compromise. So what's happening on the compromised host. So you've got persistence, privilege escalation, and all the rest, right? So things, typically stages that happen once you've compromised that host. So they have a categorization. They actually have a really good JSON database where you can pull out the data, match some of your events to actually identify, let me rephrase that, to potentially identify the actor, right? Because they've categorized different activities and they've mapped them together and they pull them together into a mapping of actors. Here's my problem with this, right? So people start to map these activities to what they're seeing in their threat hunting or their incident response process. The problem is that if you actually know attackers, they do not do things in a constant state. They are, I said it before, they're creative. They adapt to your environment. So basically, it becomes like this. There is no straight line when an attacker compromises you. So you can't really put this, what's going on in your environment, and you can't really just detect based on a set of structured information. The structured information, this stuff is really good for reporting and for basically saying, okay, I found this information, I've done my incident response, this is what I saw, and this is what happened, and these are the steps that happened based on MITRE, based on whatever categorization system you're using. I don't like to, when I'm doing an initial investigation or initial search in my events, I don't want to categorize. I'm going to get into this in a bit, but if you start to categorize, you're already thinking of the next steps. You're already thinking, this is the type of attack that I'm seeing, when it might not be. So you're limiting your field of vision. That's why you should avoid categorizing any attack until you've finished actually analyzing every event. So then we started to talk about user analytics. So user and endpoint behavioral analytics. If you know what that is, it's basically statistical analysis of what's going on the endpoint. Situational awareness can drive your hunt as well. So you identify your critical assets. So focus on, because you could have a lot of data, right? You could have a lot, if you're in a big company, you could have hundreds of thousands of endpoints. So focus on the critical aspects. Focus on your CEOs. Focus on the top management. Focus on the servers that have the most important data. We have GDPR coming in Europe, right? Everybody's ready for GDPR, right? Yeah. But what's the critical asset in GDPR? Personal data. So when you're doing your threat hunting, because you do need to report in those 72 hours, remember, you focus your attention on the events that are coming from where you're storing personal data, and you've mapped, hopefully, where you're storing personal data. Do risk assessments to actually map that information. You can also do intelligence-driven, right? So you can rely on IOCs, TTPs, threat feeds. What that does is it helps you identify things that are already known. So you can drive your attention to something that's unknown. So you can move to the next step in that process, right? I'm talking about a process, but there actually really isn't a process. It's about finding things and then just following the thread, right? So you pull that string and you just follow it down the road, finding things. So machine learning. I left it to last in this slide because machine learning is something special. Vendors are starting to say, oh, we have machine learning in our solution. It'll help you drive your analysis. It'll help you drive your detections and things like that. The problem is machine learning comes in various forms. Okay? So this is some information from Alex Pinto. So if you don't know Alex Pinto, he works for an organization called NIDL. He's actually Brazilian. He does a lot of work on machine learning and artificial intelligence. And this is his hunting automation maturity model. Basically what he's saying is that you have different types of quote-unquote machine learning. The top one is very simple. You're matching an IOC, you're doing signature-based, so you're removing your events. The second one is more about statistical methods, so you're drawing statistics, so you're doing a statistical analysis of the events and the data that you're seeing. The third one is supervised machine learning, incorporating everything that you've seen before, and then starting to build models where you can actually trigger events based on or remove the noise that you're seeing based on a lot more better intelligence and a lot better information than you had before. But at the end of the day, the best artificial intelligence will be the ones that matches the human. Unfortunately, The top part, you can describe as lame because anybody can do threat feed matching and IOC matching. Then you're going from predictive incident response to proactive incident response. And what we really want to do is we want to be in that proactive framework. The human part, it's just magic. Okay? I mean, when we get there, they won't need us anymore, right? But at the end of the day, nothing is better than a pair of eyes attached to a human brain. The human brain can think in many, many different ways. Computers are based on math. Math have formulas. Formulas are analytic. They draw a line. A human brain can twist things around and move them around and remap things much more quicker than a computer can. So this got me into a position where I'm like, okay, hold on a second. Maybe I'm doing something wrong when I'm looking at these events. So before we carry on, I want you to look at this image, right? Focus on the image. For those of you who have seen this presentation before, please don't spoil it for the others, right? So I picked up some information. I think it was in the Social Engineering podcast where they interviewed Amy E. Herman. So she is like a professor in art or a doctorate in art, but she's taken her way of learning and way of thinking to help people, and specifically, like real-world forensics teams, like police forensics teams, to look at a scene in a different manner. So she wrote this book, Visual Intelligence, and she also has a course called The Art of Perception, which teaches you how to see things differently. And when I was reading this, I was like, okay, so hold on a second. Maybe I could apply this to actually a threat hunting process where I'm looking at raw data and raw events. It's like looking at things in a different manner. So she describes 4 phases to this. So the assessment is you take your first look, you do your first initial information, then you analyze, then you articulate what you've seen. So you describe it and you explain it. Then you adapt your way of thinking to reanalyze, to focus better on what's going on in front of you. Because the problem is, this is a quote from Henry David Thoreau, a US poet, we find only what we're looking for. So if you think, oh, I'm looking for APT29, this is where we go back to that MITRE attack stuff. If you think, I'm looking for this attacker, you're only going to think about looking for that attacker, and you're only going to look for those types of events. So she talks about Sappervader, which is basically a term from Leonardo da Vinci, which he talks about knowing how to see. Sorry, just trying to clear my throat a bit. So knowing how to see. So rethinking how you're looking at things, rethinking how you proceed. Then you have something called inattentional blindness. So I'm going to get into that a little bit afterwards. Then you make assumptions. So in this phase of articulating, you make assumptions. So she uses imagery and everything. So you see like an event. Like recently I was in a discussion because if you use Microsoft Teams, which is like Slack, Teams gets launched by update. Okay, so if you're not monitoring update, what's being launched by update, you miss that Teams has been launched. So then you start to think, well, okay, so if I'm assuming this, then that means update's a safe program. Is it? I don't know. What if the attacker realizes that if you launch something from update, it doesn't get picked up by your detection mechanisms? So the attacker is going to find out how to go in, use update to launch his applications, or his attacks, or his 0 days. So you can't make assumptions, right? So when you're looking at the events, you need to think, what's going on? I need to analyze this properly. Perspective. You need to refocus we're back to a little bit. If I'm looking for this information, I'm always going to look for that information. I won't see it. So I want you to watch this video and count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. Okay? Okay. So, how many of you think, well, how many of you counted the balls? How many balls are there? Okay, well, I'll get to it. How many of you think I care how many balls there are? I don't. There are 16, if you really want to know. Passes. But, did you see the gorilla? Okay, very obvious, right? I should accelerate the video actually, but that's the way it's played. So this isn't me. This is David G. Simmons. He plays on this inattentional blindness. He teaches you how to look. Again, something about looking. Did you see the girl in black leave? Last one. Did you see the curtain change color? And this is inattentional blindness. I asked you to focus on something. You focused on that one thing, and you missed out on other things, right? So it's like the woman in red in Matrix. So everybody's seen Matrix here, right? Well, most of you have seen Matrix. You know, he's focusing on the woman in red, and bam, he could be dead, right? It's the same problem. So if you're focusing on finding one specific attacker, you might be missing something, or you might be missing a step. You might be missing an event that could be critical in how your environment was compromised. So this picture, who knows what this is? What is this a picture of? Sorry, I don't have any prizes. I forgot. I might have some stickers, but some BSides London stickers, maybe.
I've never seen the picture. I would say it's a skull.
I think you have seen the picture, haven't you? No, really?
I've seen the video.
So the picture, it is a cow. If I draw the cow, now you see it, right? So if I go back, do you still see the cow? Okay. This is about focusing your view and looking at things in a different way, right? And actually trying to find the details. So this is called Renshaw's cow. It's a very old picture of a cow, like, you know, in the early days of photography. So, as I said, I work on protecting the endpoint. Data lives on the endpoint. And for me, an endpoint is a server, a mobile, it could be a PC, laptop, whatever. So again, a play on the words of Tweety, right? I thought a pretty cat. I thought I thought many pretty hats. So something's fishy, but it's not my food. Well, actually, in our terms, it's something suspicious, not necessarily malicious. So when you're going through this data, you might see something that looks weird that you've never seen before. It does not mean it's malicious, right? You need to pull more data out to understand exactly what's going on. You notice I still haven't actually given you like a timeline or a step-by-step explanation, because there is none. Remember, I said at the beginning, it's about looking at events and finding something. And looking at events is you open your events and you look for things. But you can actually focus it. So I focus on the endpoint, so one of the key aspects of the endpoint are processes, right? So you want to look at which processes are running, what are their normal conditions, who do they belong to, you know, are they signed, which vendor, which account are they running on, privilege escalation. If you have a very standard environment, if you live in a standard environment, corporate environment, you should know which processes are allowed to have privilege escalation, right? Think, you know, that CC cleaner incident, right? That was mentioned earlier, actually, in this track as well. That CC cleaner incident can happen because CC cleaner runs with privilege escalations, right? And if you compromise that privilege escalation process, then you have a door into that environment. So a lot of third-party applications, because they don't want to respect whatever operating systems they want, you know, and the use of non-admin privilege and things like that, they try to escalate privileges. Also know which users are running as local admin. You should actually, I mean, in a good corporate environment, you shouldn't have any local admins, right? Everything should be running on a domain or something like that, where you have a very specific local admin. Network activity. Which processes are doing outbound connections? Which processes are listening? So, you know, I challenge you, go and look at the processes that actually do network connections. The problem is it's getting worse and worse. So, we run Office 365. If you pull down the latest version of Office, it's like it connects to every freaking domain in Microsoft when it launches, right? It goes to Skype, it goes to Live, it goes to Microsoft, it goes to Windows Update. It's like, why? Make sure you understand which process is supposed to be making network connections. So you can't really see this, but this is a dump of a process tree. I've got C script here, right? Launched from WinWord. Okay, that's already suspicious. But then it doesn't call out to the internet. In a corporate environment, why would C script be calling the internet? There's absolutely no reason for it. So that's where you would start to look at things. And look at your local firewalls. Do you have local firewalls being set? Are they being taken down by some script? If you really want to go deep and avoid things like stucknet, you need to understand what's inside the kernel and what DLLs and drivers are being loaded. You need to understand what the persistence keys, what are the scheduled tasks, what are the services that are running on your environment. It gets very complicated, right? Especially scheduled tasks. I mean, you think, oh, I shouldn't have that many scheduled tasks. Open a default Windows installation. There's about 60 or 70 scheduled tasks just for Windows, right? So, why the endpoint? Well, it's a target of the attackers. As an attacker, if I compromise a sysadmin's endpoint, I can get full access to the environment. I can get full access to the network, right? If I compromise somebody who's managing personal data, I can get that personal data, right? So you collect the configuration, you pull as much data as you can. The negative effect is that you quickly go through data explosion, and you're sitting there in front of your monitor and in front of the data that you pulled, and you're like, where the hell do I start? How am I going to take this? How am I going to do this? Right? So I started looking at, well, let's bring some intelligence into the match, right? So let's see what all of these different solutions actually bring. This is old. This is 2006, early 2016. So some of these have evolved. I will give the slides to the team so they can post them if they post them. They're out there anyway. This isn't the first time I've given this, but you definitely have different aspects, right? But these are costly solutions. I mean, our company's on there. It's not. If you have the budget, it's good to have a solution like this. If you don't have a budget, Microsoft actually has a solution for you, Sysmon. Sysmon will pull all of the data that you saw there, you can pull from Sysmon. But again, if you just pull Sysmon out, it generates a lot of noise. And you can get a lot of data out of it. I understand this is focused on Windows, just that, it's easier to talk about Windows on this. Because Linux, if you think about Linux, it's pretty easy to actually get a lot of events from it. You just turn on heavy logging and things like that. Mac, I can do a lot of logging on there as well. Sysmon, so there's a GitHub from Swift on Security, if you know the Twitter handle. There's a lot of good configurations to understand what you need to collect and the type of information that you can get from threat hunting. So when I started, I used Excel. So it doesn't come out very well here. Let's see if I can maybe expand. So basically down here, I capture some events where I see, I think it was Excel, writing a file out, doing some network manipulations, then starting an application. That application, is started and is living in local Microsoft Win. You see the application name right here. It was actually launched initially from WSHOMICX. So I'm following these footprints, right? I'm trying to understand. So here you see Excel doing a network connection out to the internet, to an IP address. So what was interesting is I actually captured the URL also, right? So you see members.web something, can't read it from here, but why was this interesting? Because on this attack, they're actually using legitimate websites. So leséglantines.fr, these are all sites on actually OVH. So they're legitimate websites. They're run by people. So, these are probably compromised websites. But if you think about your firewall logs and your proxy logs, they're missing this. because they don't know that Excel did that connection, right? They just saw an innocent connection go out to a website. And most of the time when you're looking at your firewall logs, you're going to miss it as well because you're just seeing an innocent connection going out to the website. When you marry it with this, then you're going, oh, hold on a second, that's not right. Excel shouldn't be going to that website. So then we can gather more evidence. This is a different attack, still Excel. I love Excel. You know how we complain that all of these business applications that use Excel with all the complicated macros and you know, all these analysis sheets? I'm one of those idiots that does that. So this is another one. This is actually a, which one is this? This is a ransomware that starts. So here you see a doc.js file being opened, okay? And it leads to some network connections. Then you start to see a W script here. So it's doing some kind of script, and it's launching a process called A.2. Then you see that same script doing some registry manipulations, right? I mean, most of this would have been caught by standard AV, but I'm just showing, this is just for demonstration, for showing purposes. Then you see this script, right? And it's doing all this for loop. I don't know, wait a minute. For loop, for C:\\. Okay. So if you know Windows command line, this is essentially a command line going through every file in the disk. Ooh, I'm running out of time, I think. Am I doing for time okay? 20 minutes. Okay, so we're good. So then you see, after it does this, it's feeding file names into this command, a.0.exe a minus a. So who recognizes this command outside of the a.0? Right? This is what I'm talking about, learning how to look. How many of you use 7-zip and as a command line? Who's done 7-zip with a command line? Okay. Exercise when you go home, look up 7-zip command line. 7-zip to archive, it's 7zip.exe a minus mxo minus mhe, which is the parameters of the archive. Then you go minus p, and you put a password on it, right? So there's the key. No, there's the key for your encrypted data. And then it basically does an archive name. Notice the archive name. And then it does, that's the original file. And then it goes off and deletes the original file. So, remember I told you earlier how the attackers were using their own tools against you, or were using tools that are normal system tools or normal user tools against us? This is one example. They've changed the name, yes. It's called a.0.exe. But it's 7-zip, right? Antiviruses don't flag this because it's 7-zip. It's green. You throw this a.0.exe into VirusTotal, everything's green. You look at the properties, the unchangeable properties of the binary, it's 7-zip, made by the guy who does 7-zip. So this is the kind of thing that if you're not looking properly, you might miss, right? So back to my problem is we're generating too much data at the endpoint, right? So one of the things I started looking at back in 2016 is how can we move intelligence into that endpoint? So have some kind of machine learning that says, okay, these are the normal operations that I see every day, so I don't need to report them. Still working on it. I just need to find the right people to actually develop it and do it properly. But if you have a rule engine in your endpoint solution, you can start to actually build simple rules that will trigger on whitelisted stuff and remove the events before you collect them. So there's a threat in your environment, so you want to start looking for them, right? So I gave you some examples of data that I did with pure Excel. So how do you get your hands dirty? Well, I talked about it earlier. You might need a SIM. You might need or use Excel like me if you're mad. But essentially what you're doing is you're looking for things, right? So look for very long URLs or URIs. Look for weird user agent strings. That's in your proxy logs. Look for DGAs and the age of the domains. So this is a lot of work. It's a lot of things that you can't really automate. Look at the file execution, where it was started from, app data, %temp. You'd be surprised how many applications you have to whitelist that run in app data. Chrome is one of them, for example. If Chrome is installed at the user level, it's done in app data. Why? Because third-party applications have found, oh, wait, I can install binaries in app data and the user can launch them in user mode. Yeah, but so do the attackers, right? Network ports. Try and run some netstack commands and collect the netstack commands on the endpoints. See who's doing a listen. See who's doing receiving connections. Use your good old-fashioned command lines. Who am I? Net user. Collect all this data. Do net view, net stats. So launch control, SC, these bottom ones, right? These bottom ones are essentially service launching, right? So launch control is on Mac, SC service you can use on Linux, SC is on Windows, NetStart on Windows, task list. You got PSA-A to find out who ran recently, things like that. So then you've got your scheduled tasks, things like you're looking for things that shouldn't be in them. So you're going to generate a lot of data, as I said. So this is some examples. What's this one? So this is PowerShell. Whoop. So, getting tired. Sorry. So this is PowerShell doing network operations. Again, got to think, why is PowerShell communicating out to some IP address, right? So here I'm just logging network operations from PowerShell. Come on, what's going on? Okay. So this is application start. So we're looking at, PowerShell. So these are actually rule triggers to highlight data. So we're looking at PowerShell being launched off WMI. What I don't have in here is the parent application. This is some of the, just like pure searches that we do in Splunk. So you're looking at application. This should actually have the parent application, so I could show you that it was WMI. But you can also, this is like an analytics interface. So here we're looking for launches of CSRS, right? CSRS, and normally it's launched in Windows 32, but here we have one that's been launched in temp, right? So that's typically somebody trying to bypass security, trying to get privilege escalations. So then, if I look at all the CMD launches, right, in an environment, I could have that many launches of CMD, okay? And these are launching from the proper place. Well, except for this barcode PKI. Well, actually, barcode PKI, problem is it does some weird things. So that's it's like, these are third-party solutions I was talking to you about that do weird things and that you have to live with. So sometimes you find things like this. You go, okay, what do I do with it? Well, you kind of whitelist it until something happens. But what you want to do is you want to focus on really weird things. So like, CMD launching some weird processes. So this is the parent application, and CMD was launched from these parent applications, right? So, for example, why is CMD being launched from net.exe, right? Or why is CMD being launched from this TDE server 64? So this is stuff that you would go through and try to figure out what's going on. And what can help is if you have the actual command line associated to this, right? So you can actually see what command line is being used to understand if it's bad or if it's good. So what's this one? Sorry, I forgot. Weird executable names. So this one we're looking for 2 characters, right? So we're matching AZ09 2 characters .exe. I've got another one with 1 character, for example. 1 character executables are weird in an environment. So you're looking for where they're being launched from. So you see SC is normal, 7-zip, HG. And that's where you start to look at, okay, these are Altasian source tree. So those are probably okay. And this is what, you're just looking for things, right? So you're looking for all of these data aspects so you can bring them into tables and look at them in a different way. So one of the things that I like to look at is basically email attachments that are clicked on. So these are some of the email attachments that people have clicked on, so you can start from there, right? So what happens when this PDF got opened or this docx got opened? And you can see if they've clicked on a URL as well, right? So I would be looking at these weird URLs that are really, really, really long, right? And from there, you can associate it to maybe a launch or an application launch. So this is an example of some of the stuff found. So this is a new user being added. These are PSX. So all of this is essentially a launch of a single character binary. So the first one is sticky key vulnerability. This is a ransomware. So regex is your friend. If you don't know regex, you need to learn regex to do threat hunting. Trust me, because you need to be able to parse data in a quick manner. So these are some of the ones that kind of use. So top, I'm just looking for stupid things like password dumping programs. Some attackers are dumb, right? There's a story behind that too. These are some of the domain name generation for a ransomware. So you're looking for stuff like this, right? Here's some more. So this one was a cute one. One of the guys that I asked to do, like one of the guys that was doing this, he wrote out every letter.exe because he didn't know regex. Okay? So here, looking for registry key changes. So disable password change, for example. That's persistence, adding user counts. Down there we have some more. Does anybody know what this one is? Highlighted in green. Yes, but what am I doing? Yeah, exactly. You're making copies of the Active Directory so you can exit the information so you can dump it with maybe cats or just brute force it. So PowerShell is the new cool. You would not believe how much PowerShell you find nowadays. And I'm not talking like admin PowerShell. I'm talking like some really weird crap. This stuff, come on. This stuff is PowerShell. It's valid PowerShell. It runs. Okay? It's essentially just basically it's variable assignments, and at the end you just run all the variables added together. Right? And in PowerShell you can do this. So I highly recommend you look at Daniel Bohannon's work. I think he works in Mandiant, still works in Mandiant. But he's done some really cool stuff around this type of PowerShell and written some really cool blogs about how you can obfuscate PowerShell within PowerShell. I mean, you're literally obfuscating PowerShell within PowerShell. You can dump a PowerShell script into a clipboard and pipe it into PowerShell. So these are some of the commands that we, you detect, right? This is PowerShell running an encoded command. So a base64 encoded command, right? So you basically have to take the base64 and decode it to figure out what the hell it's doing. It's a lot of work, right? So you can associate it to threat feeds. So you can do virus total to weed out all the stuff that virus total knows about. You can, if you've got some intelligence feeds, like if you work in the back industry, you might have some intelligence feeds. So I'm almost finished. If you want to do this, essentially what you need to do is prepare your team, right? People have asked me, can I hire some threat hunters? It's like, yeah, you can hire threat hunters. I just don't believe in it because you need to have an understanding of how the business operates. So you need to have somebody who's been in the existing incident response team for a while. You need to find thinkers as well, people that don't just process a procedure, people who will think out of the box and do things and look at things in a different manner, who will think out, who will be creative, who will draw a picture instead of typing words, for example. There's psychometric tests that you can actually test people, but I don't want to get into that because nowadays it's a little bit thing. Start small, right? Get one person, give him a task like, okay, this Friday, instead of doing your normal incident response, do some threat hunting. See if you can find something. One of the things that some people I've talked to recommend is you actually give like a bounty, right? You do like an internal CTF. The first guy who finds something that we've never seen before gets like an Amazon gift certificate. Incorporate what you're doing into your incident response and your existing knowledge, your security policies and security procedures. Once you have the hang of it, you can start to build harder, stronger runs and threat hunts. So I hope it was interesting. I mean, this isn't the first time I've given this presentation. A lot of people ask me questions afterwards, and it makes you think in a different way, right? If you've never heard of threat hunting, if you're doing incident response and you're tired of that, just like that one all the time procedure, this is a different way of looking at things. Thank you.
Questions? Come on, guys.
They're tired. They want to go home.
There's still the
There's a
closing
question right there in
session.
front.
We still have prizes and stuff.
I've been earlier at the presentation, and it was about men in the browser attacks.
Yeah.
And in this case, I'm curious if you would have that kind of threat. For example, you would have an add-on on your browser that could, for example, have a hook on, have a form-grabbing hook.
Mm.
In this case, you would just see, you would just have your traffic redirected to something else, but it would still be
Chrome,
yeah.
right? So this is where we come to, you have to go back in time. So you have to have that, historical data that you could potentially have. What you would be looking for in that situation is what CRXs were downloaded or installed. That you can detect. Because Chrome actually, when it installs a new CRX, it actually downloads it into temp, and then puts it into memory to run it and to put it into your app data folder, right? There's a footprint of that CRX somewhere. So what you need to understand is look at, if you're in an organization that's got policies and things like that, you probably limit the number of CRXs you can install. If you're not, you kind of need to track what CRXs are being installed and why are they being installed, right? That's where maybe threat intelligence comes in as well, right? So if you're seeing that Chrome is sending, remember one slide I had proxy bytes in, bytes out? Mm. So you're going to see a lot of traffic going to that to those sites, to the IP addresses that are not necessarily the normal sites that you would see coming out of that endpoint, right? Because when the user's running Chrome, he'll probably be going to Google. You see a lot of traffic going to Google, his bank, his things like that. What you're going to see is additional traffic at the same time it's going to IP addresses that you've never seen before. It's kind of when you come into having to trend what's the normal network activity coming out of the endpoints and highlighting that difference in the normal and this new data traffic which you're seeing. That's probably where machine learning is actually going to help, because you'll be able to baseline the normal sites that the user would go to and then have that machine learning aspect highlight sites that it's never seen before.
Yeah, so move a bit away from the host-based approach towards a network traffic-based approach.
Yeah, so one of the things, because I tend to focus on the endpoint here, you should be collecting all the, when you're doing this, one of the reasons I said you need a SIM or an ELK is because you're actually merging your network data and your endpoint data, right? So the example I gave with Excel, the next step would have been to actually dump the network data as well from the network perspective, see where it's going, and see what maybe I captured in the proxies, or if I did any, PCAPs or anything like that, because because one of the tools picked up on PCAPs. So you need to merge everything. I give a snapshot of what we're looking at. There's another question back. What about privacy? So he's asking, what about privacy and anonymity of the data? GDPR. I do a GDPR talk as well. There's one technical word in GDPR that's not encryption. Pseudo-anonymization. Pseudo-anonymization is basically taking away those characteristics. So here's the issue. Most of the endpoint solutions will just gather the data, send it to your server and everything like that. So if you really want to keep that privacy, you'd have to put in a processor that's taking the data that's coming off the endpoints or coming off the network, and then just remove any potentially, let's say, identifiable information. However, if I go to the context of GDPR, because that's easier, that kind of data is allowed under the GDPR, as long as you've told people, etc. Because there is a provision in the GDPR that says that you are allowed to collect personal data in the case of protecting that personal data. So using security tools to help you protect your environment. So you have that kind of like exception clause. So this would fall under that exception clause as long as you handle it right, report it, and notify people that you're doing it. So that it's not really probably the answer that you wanted to hear, but that's how you get around it. Yeah, it depends on the policy, exactly.
Any more questions? No? Well, thank you very much again, Thomas, for
Thank you for having me.